Another press story here about how this is a little more explicit version of a lie, but very interesting. Alec Karakatsanis, if you don't follow him, I strongly encourage you to. He's constantly tweeting about the Justice Department and law enforcement and putting facts out there that the mainstream media is not going to enlighten the public with, right? So this is a thread I want to read for you guys. Thread. Yesterday, the New York Times published a headline it knew was false. The implications of this are dangerous for everyone who cares about an informed public. Here's what happened. New York Times wrote another pro-police propaganda piece that had all of the usual problems I've discussed before. More on that below. But the editors chose to add a headline that stated that, quote, murders doubled overnight in the Bronx, New York. Here's where it gets devious, and you guys can see the title there. After murders doubled overnight, the NYPD is solving fewer cases. In the Bronx, where the percentage of murders solved by the police has plunged, one family is waiting impatiently for a day that may not come. Now, he's going to go into this, but I want you to note that they put the single quotes around doubled overnight. That's important. And here he explains that. Notice that the NYT editors chose to put the doubled overnight in quotes. Why? It's a signal they aren't reporting it as a verified fact, but as a quote from a source. In the article body, we learn they are quoting a former cop turned local professor. Here it gets more devious. In the article body, it's not murders that the former cop expert is saying doubled overnight. He is actually claiming that police caseloads doubled overnight. In other words, the force itself is in charge of this, you guys. It's just an allocation of resources issue. Let me note here that this expert is wrong. It isn't true that caseloads literally doubled overnight. New York Times didn't quote an opposing expert, show stats, tell readers that the person they quoted was wrong, it's verifiable with some reporting, or disclose he was a former cop. So they just ran with this quote that they knew was not only misleading, but factually incorrect. And they ran with it as a headline, which is even worse, because a lot of people read a headline and don't read the body, right? So they knew full well what they were doing here and how this was going to impact public opinion. The New York Times even let this former police officer expert add, that's the unfortunate truth. It's not the truth. Here it gets worse. See the sleight of hand? New York Times editors took the false caseloads quote, put it in quotes, and then put it in the headline as applying to murders. They did this because a larger number of people will see the headline. They did it to create clicks and outrage. It's all false. Murders didn't double overnight, not even close, as others have noted. The New York Times editors knew that, hence putting it in quotations so they could deny making the assertion themselves. And he shares a quote here from Chloe Cockburn. It's truly mind-boggling how supposedly respectable news outlets print totally false things we can easily check by looking at public data about crime. And people swallow it because they never expect the New York Times to completely misrepresent something as basic as this. She goes on to share another tweet that verifies what they're saying. Note that the insertion of the quotes, the easily available homicide data that New York Times has itself reported on before, and the many people pointing out the lie make it clear that editors chose to print this falsity intentionally, and it's still up online and Twitter a day later. We have an update on that coming later in the thread. But as an aside, the expert point about caseloads was also silly. It's an NYPD choice to devote smaller numbers of cops to serious crimes, and most cops are arresting very poor people for drugs and minor stuff. 96% of all police time nationwide is on what cops call non-violent. That's according to police departments themselves, you guys. So when they hand-wring about, you can't cut our budgets, what about all the violent crime? They're currently only putting 4% of their resources to violent crime. So don't let them get away with that. That's not what they do. So we could cut 96% of their budget without touching violent crime. Okay. The rest of the article is outrageous. Here are the expert sources it quotes supposedly to help explain what's happening. 1, a police lieutenant. 2, the police say generically. Don't you love that one? It's like when a CNN anchor says, well, people say, and what they really mean is all these Washington establishment goons are telling me, right? But they frame it like, well, people are saying. A former cop, undisclosed. Another former cop, undisclosed. Another police lieutenant, and that's it. So what did they do? They regurgitated what cops say. They played stenographer for police departments. The article is propaganda. I love that term. Without contrary views, experts, civil liberties advocates, crime survivors who disagree, etc. Article lets cops call for more surveillance in more surveyed communities. The police say some of the city's most dangerous pockets do not have enough. The police say. Gee, I wonder why the police might want more fucking money. But what do the mostly poor, mostly people of color who've been organizing across New York City against New York PD's expanded and profitable corporate military contractor surveillance programs think? We aren't told because the New York Times chooses to leave out their voice. That's an editorial choice. It gets worse. New York Times then lets anonymous police spew a discredited police union talking point that these issues are caused by new laws requiring shares of basic info with defense lawyers to bring New York State in line with the rest of the country, example, Texas and the Constitution. So now they want to claim that defense attorneys shouldn't be given information that they have a constitutional right to. That claim is garbage. Ali Watkins, who's the New York Times writer who wrote this piece of trash. It's astonishing that New York Times lets anonymous police sources blame this on basic discovery laws that exist across the country and are a basic component of truth in trials. There is no evidence to support it and no contrary point of view printed. Even worse, New York Times then lets a lieutenant blame poor communities of color for not cooperating with cops. Laughably, lieutenant blames a lack of desire to work with cops on due process discovery laws, not on decades of corruption, brutality, and ineffectiveness in making people safe. You cannot make this shit up, you guys. You really cannot make this shit up. New York Times editors chose not to print a contrary point of view to explain why poor communities might not like cooperating with the largest and most racially discriminatory human caging bureaucracy in modern world history that many believe has not kept them safe but made them less safe. It's part of at least three broader patterns. First, the New York Times has a long and disturbing recent history of propaganda, and he shares some examples there. Second, corporate news in general often disproportionately covers and creates a sense of urgency about certain kinds of crime, but does not create the same urgency around objectively larger threats to public health and safety. And again, he's posting threads here as evidence. If you guys want to go check it out, I encourage you to. Third, when it does cover a narrow range of crime, New York Times often links problems to police talking points. Need for more cops, weapons, surveillance, and human caging. This link is profitable to corporations, but it's like climate denial given the available science. And we went over just a few weeks ago a thread by Alec breaking down some of the stats that disprove this notion that caging people somehow, cuts down on crime. It doesn't at all. The stats just don't bear that out at all. There are many wonderful journalists working to shed light on the great issues of our time, like the things that threaten our survival as a species and that makes society less safe and just. But this threatens that work by boosting police repression and reducing trust in the media. Update. Here is a profanity-laden tirade by the ex-cop professor quoted in the New York Times piece confirming that the headline is false. The headline is still up, even though yesterday the person quoted said publicly he was misquoted. And they give credit here to the journalist. I went and looked at that thread, you guys. The guy that they quoted, the ex-cop, the professor that they quoted, said that he never said what the New York Times put in quotes. I mean, it gets even worse and even more disingenuous as we dig deeper. The New York Times has now changed the headline to remove the false claim. Will be interesting to see if paper issues a correction explaining who made the decision to print the knowingly false claim, how the decision was made, and why. Another update, the former police officer turned professor who New York Times chose to quote has now blocked me for some reason. I don't think I've ever spoken to him online or otherwise. Here's a screenshot of the relevant portion of his tirade where he agrees that the headline is false. Update. Others have pointed out that I missed another blatant pro-police lie in the New York Times article that New York police had been solving 90% of murders. Again, public data is easily accessible. They are not. You see these numbers down here, 27, 26, 32, and 26. Not 90% of murders. New York Times reporter repeated false claims on Twitter. So far, the paper has issued no explanation of how this could happen and what kinds of accountability there will be. This stuff matters, especially to those who will be targeted if the cops quoted get what they want. And another update, New York Times reporter Ali Watkins has not corrected the tweet about this. I've commented on this reporter's bias before, but at this point, we need to understand from the editors how this is allowed to continue. Here is a piece I hope they grapple with. Just fantastic work here from Alec. Really encourage you all to follow him if you don't. at Equality Alec on Twitter, always sharing stuff like this. And shame on the New York Times. Again, it's not necessarily surprising, but this is a pretty brazen and egregious version of the propaganda, as Alec calls it, compared to what we often see. So that goes beyond disingenuity, you guys, where it's like, we're going to mislead you, we're going to misframe things, we're going to take things out of context. That is an out and out lie that they printed in a disingenuous way, knowing the impact that would have on readers. It's egregious, beyond egregious. And it also it disproves any sort of like legitimate incentive or principled incentive. You can't just say, well, they screwed up, because what's the goal in printing something like that, even if you think it's true? The goal is to stoke fear. Okay, so there's no principled like, no, the public needs to know about this. No, your goal is to fearmonger and divide, right? With the obvious added incentive of police budgets and pro-police nonsense, right? So I thought that was very worth discussing. Huge shout out to Alec for the stuff he puts out there and the way that he breaks these things down for those who would not otherwise have been exposed to the way that the New York Times operates on these stories. Great work from Alec. Shame on the New York Times. They need to come out and explain what the fuck happened there. That's even worse than the stuff they normally do, really. So we have